Hey guys, Ben here with Oddly Armed, and today we're going to be taking a look at the first of the classic rifles that we're going to be adding to the tier list. And really cool thing about this is it's going to be kind of a progenitor to some of the stuff that we're going to see. But this is, of course, an Armalite AR-180. So this is classic 80s rifle, and a lot of its features ended up getting passed on to some of the other rifles that we're going to be looking at. Let's go ahead, get a close-in look at it, and talk about some history. Getting into the history of the Armalite AR-18 series, it really starts back in the 1950s when the U.S. Ordnance Corps was looking to replace the then aging M1 Garand from World War II and before vintage with something a little bit newer and more modern. At that point, there were three main contenders in the trial. The first one, of course, being the M14, which would go on to win the trial. The second being the FNFAL, which would unfortunately lose the trial, but a lot of people think that should have been the victor if not for the third rifle, the AR-10 from Armalite. And that was Eugene Stoner's original 7.62 by 51 millimeter design. And it was by far the most advanced of the three entrants to the trial at that point. Used space age materials like polymer and forged aluminum, which lightened its weight quite a bit when compared to the FAL and the M14, not to mention the M1 Garand. Now, Armalite was looking at potential other customers if they were to lose the trial to replace the M1 Garand, which they eventually did. And one of the things that makes the AR-10 not a very attractive rifle to some customers is how complicated it is to make that forged and machined aluminum receiver set. It takes a lot of machinery to be able to do it. You have to have the forging equipment to actually make the billet. So it takes a good amount of actual logistics support to make it happen. And this is where we start getting into stamping, which was really taking off as a very popular way of making a receiver at near the end of World War II and getting into the post-World War II time frame, primarily because of the Germans and some of the real technological strides they made with stamping out their own receivers for like the STG-44, the MG-42, and the FG-42, which all heavily utilized stampings in their construction. And utilizing stampings, Eugene Stoner and Armalite came up with a design that was originally the AR-12, and they further developed on that and came out with the AR-16, which was essentially a 7.62 by 51 NATO short stroke gas piston of what eventually became the AR-18 AR-180. And jumping back into the AR-15 series, eventually the AR-10 lost those trials, and then Eugene Stoner and Ed Sullivan went on to miniaturize the AR-10 into the AR-15, changing it from the 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO cartridge to the 5.56 or 223 Remington at the time for that. And at that point, the AR-15 didn't get a lot of interest, didn't get a lot of customers, and Armalite and Fairchild, which was the parent company for Armalite, really lost interest in the AR-15. And they ended up selling the rights to the design to Colt, which ended up being a very, very costly mistake for them. So at this point, Armalite no longer had the legal rights to build the AR-15, so they found themselves without a solid product, solid military rifle, and they went back to the AR-16 and were like, well, I guess we can miniaturize this the same way we did with the AR-15, and that's where we ended up with this, the AR-18 AR-180. So finally getting into the AR-18, there were three primary companies who actually built the AR-18 once it hit the market. The first was going to be Armalite themselves in Costa Mesa, California, and they made the AR-18 and the civilian variant, the semi-auto AR-180, between 1969 and 1972, primarily for the civilian market. At which point, they ended up actually not doing very well. They didn't sell a ton of them, so they eventually just licensed the design of the AR-18 to Howa of Japan, who would go on to produce them from 1970 to 1974. And these are arguably the best quality AR-18s that you're going to be able to get your hands on. So another important note for Howa when they went and made their version of the AR-18 is even though they ceased production of the AR-18, it still had quite a big influence on their domestic rifle production. And the eventual Type 89 that they would build and then also equip the Japanese military with was really a heavily modified version of the AR-18. The third and final manufacturer of the AR-180 was Sterling in the UK, and they made the AR-18 AR-180 from 1979 up until 1985. And my example of the AR-180 here is one of the Sterling-made rifles. Now, of the three manufacturers, the Sterling ones are generally considered to be the lowest quality in terms of fit, finish, and overall looks, with, of course, the Howas being the top of the line, and then the Costa Mesas being somewhere in the middle. And between all three of those manufacturers, there weren't a ton of rifles that were made. Just under 22,000 or so AR-180s in total were produced between 1969 and 1985, without any serious militaries adopting it as a primary rifle. And of course, the most famous actual user of the AR-18 was the Irish Republican Army in their fight against the Brits. The IRA even had a song called Little Armalite talking about the AR-180 and their love for the platform. Even though it's kind of a crappy rifle, it still got a lot of love there since it was one of the more advanced designs that they could get their hands on. In 1985, the original production series of the AR-18 ended, and in 2001, it kind of came back as the AR-180B, which was a heavily modified version of the original AR-180, where the upper receiver, the stamping, all of that stuff was essentially the same, but the lower receiver was replaced with pretty much all polymer components, and then it also utilized standard AR-15 style magazines as well as AR trigger groups. AR-180B was eventually discontinued in 2007, at which point there was another gap where there are no AR-180-like things really being made anymore, until 2019 when Brownells released the BRN 180 Upper, which was really more of a cool homage back to the original AR-180 than anything else. The operating system was essentially the same, where you have the same short stroke gas piston as well as a very, very similar bolt and recoil assembly design. However, some of the spirit of the rifle was lost just because it used a forged aluminum upper receiver similar to the AR-15, unlike the original stamped receiver components from the AR-180. So given that the AR-18 was essentially a flop, it didn't have any real commercial sales to speak of, and it wasn't adopted by any major militaries around the world. So why do we care about the AR-180? And that's when we start getting into some of the influence that it's had on later designs. One aspect of that influence is the gas system, so the short stroke gas piston system that the AR-180 uses, which actually was kind of derived off of the World War II Soviet SVT rifle, which was stolen by the German G43 as well, but that's essentially the same design carried down the line. And I would argue it's actually different from some other modern designs nowadays that use kind of more of a spigot type looking piston like some of the HK rifles. But I would argue that the biggest influence that the AR-180 had was the bolt carrier group design. So this is the bolt carrier group of the original AR-180 that I have. So you can see it's a pretty chunky bolt carrier that uses an AR style 7-lug rotating bolt, as well as a AR-15 style cam pin. So you can see the cam track there operating. But if you take a look at this bolt carrier design, and then here we have the CZ Bren 2, it's essentially the same. So big chunky bolt carrier. This one has a firing pin stop on it right there. But then we move on down the line again to the Bushmaster ACR. Again, same design concept. So big chunky bolt carrier, as well as a cam pin and a 7-lug rotating bolt. And even moving on from that, the G36, again, same basic design philosophy, as well as here we have the B&T APC 223, again, same design philosophy, chonky, with that cam pin in there. And then finally, the FN SCAR 16S, here we have that bolt carrier group, and again, it's that same basic design. And I really would argue that's where the main influence of the AR-18 really went since its production stopped. Go ahead and take a look at an overview of the AR-180. And sorry, this is going to be a little bit out of frame. This guy's longer than a lot of the other things I'm working on, and that's because it's got this 18-inch barrel. But starting from the front, we have just a standard kind of 3-lug flash hider up there. Then moving back, we got the front sight, as well as the sling swivel, and it does have a bayonet lug. This takes standard AR-15 style bayonets. Then we have our handguard here. So this is some very chintzy polymer, but it's going to be clamshelled right here in the middle. So that splits apart. In the disassembly video, you'll get a good look at that. And then moving back here, you have our charging handle there on the right side, as well as a little dust cover. So I can actually pop this down, just covers that little gap there, and our magazine release, our safety selector there, and then the rear sight and takedown lever. Now, as far as the stock goes, this is actually a side folding stock, so there's going to be 2 buttons here that you got to press in, and then the stock folds to the side. You can see there's a little rubber buffer there, and then if we flip it over, you have this little, you know exactly what that looks like thing on the left side of the rifle, as well as basically 2 wires inside of the stock that go over that and pops into place and holds it there. This doesn't feel very durable at all, so I don't really like to do that a whole lot, but then that just flips back out and just pops right back into place. And let's just take a quick look at the markings. So here on the left side, on the grip, you have AR-18 Armalite. So that's kind of interesting. The molding for the grips is the same between the AR-18 and the AR-180. The AR-18 is, of course, the full auto version of this, but then you have safe and semi for the selector, and then you have our manufacturing roll mark there, so you can see it's made by Sterling in England, and then just our model, caliber, as well as a serial number down there on the side. Off our ratings with accuracy, it's going to get a 3 because I was able to squeeze a 2.68 MOA group out of this rifle using 55 grain GGG Lithuanian M193 ammunition at about 100 yards, which honestly I am very happy with that outcome, particularly given that was with iron sights and with just standard military ball ammunition. Next, we're going to look at the aftermarket support for the AR-180, where it's going to garner a score of 1, and that's because there's basically nothing out there for this rifle. I know of one company, Stormworks, that makes some limited parts for it. For example, they make optics mounts, so I have one of those here. I'll give you a closer look at that, as well as some stock adapters, but that's about it. Other than that, there's really no one that still makes parts for these. And we're going to take a quick look at that Stormworks optic mount for the AR-180. This uses an aimpoint micro footprint on here. They make a couple of different other models as well. And the way this actually works is there is an optic mounting system for the AR-180, and they actually made 4 power scopes that they used to fit on this. But essentially is what you have is a spring tension plunger back here. It's actually pretty tough to use, and so I'm not going to throw it on here. But you can see there's like a little pyramidal triangular shaped dovetail on the top here, and that interacts with the dovetail on here. So essentially that plunger goes back on the rear sight, you press back, and then it'll eventually fall into its slot. So kind of an interesting way to mount optics, but again, Stormworks is the only company I know of that makes modern Picatinny adapters for it. And the next category is going to be durability, where the AR-180 is going to come in with a terrible score of 1. A lot of this actually comes from the build construction, and you can see in some places the paint is starting to flake away a little bit and even start to rust, which that's kind of on me for not addressing a little bit more. But all the materials on the AR-180, all the welds, pretty much everything is going to be fairly crude. It's not very well made. It holds up fairly well. One of the weak points especially is the welds back here where the stock is. So you can kind of see that it attaches there on the side, and then on the other side as well. So that's an area that's been known to break on these in the past. So they are known to have issues. Another issue I had was the original detent on this front pivot pin actually popped out of it, so I had to get a replacement, and that was actually really fun. But it turns out the Brownells Retro Series ARs that use a front pivot pin fits in here, so that was a really nice stroke of luck. But as far as durability goes, it's just not great 80s technology and 80s materials. Moving straight into ergonomics, I'm going to go ahead and give it a 3. So it's not the bottom of the barrel, but there's definitely some stuff that could be better. As far as the safety selector goes, it's actually ambidextrous, which is strange enough for something from the 70s and 80s. So you have it on both sides in its AR-style 90-degree safety selector. And then moving forward from there, you do have a reciprocating charging handle that's just on the right side here and kind of upswept so you can hit it from the other side, and then it also kind of acts as a shell deflector. And behind that we have a little dust cover which just covers up the back portion right here. As far as your magazine release goes, it's going to be on the right side right here. And so it's actually not terrible, all things considered, but there are definitely some areas that could use some improvement. In terms of maintenance, I'm going to give the AR-180 a 2. And when it comes to cleaning it, it's actually not bad. Disassembly is very easy on the AR-180. It's easy to get into all the little nooks and crannies in there. And to clean off bolt carrier group, piston assembly, pretty much all of that is not terrible to do. For maintenance, it really comes down to the availability of parts to replace anything that breaks on this. You break a firing pin, you break a bolt lug, you break anything else, you're pretty much screwed. You're not going to be replacing it anytime soon, unless you can find somebody who can actually build you a repair part for it. You're going to be sitting there waiting for something to pop up on the market, which could probably take a little while. Getting into modularity, this is also going to get a score of 1, and that's really because this is a quintessential 80s rifle where you're not really going to be changing anything out. You're pretty much going to keep it stock the entire time you own it. So of course we have the folding stock back here, but that's really meant to be kept original, although Stormworks does make some adapters for that. Your handguard up front, I haven't really seen any aftermarket rails for it whatsoever, so you're not going to see a whole lot there. Charging handles, you're not really going to see. Pistol grips are going to be proprietary, and kind of interesting, it has that AR-18 mold on there, so they don't have a separate one for the AR-180. But yeah, pretty much everything that you see on here is going to be the same for the lifespan of the rifle. I also want to briefly touch on magazines, which are going to be proprietary for the AR-180. So you can see here on the right side of the magazine, there's a little cutout which interacts with the magazine release here. It's just a little bit of a blade. Otherwise, this is pretty much a standard AR-15 magazine. This one's actually a converted 20-rounder magazine. As you can see, you had to kind of cut out the magazine stop there on the side, as well as make some slight modifications to the back of the magazine, as well as the follower here for it to work correctly. I also have original AR-180 magazines. I'm actually not sure who makes this one, but this is a factory mag. It fits incredibly tight in the rifle though, and it is 30+10, as well as another modified AR-15 magazine. So you can see there I have that cut out there as well as the on the follower, just a little bit of material removed from that. And then finally here we have actual Sterling AR-180 magazine, and this one you can see actually works with AR-15s as well. So the true magazines, they do have the cutout there, so it'll work back and forth between both, and then it also has that cutout on the right side. So that's another issue with the actual modularity of this rifle, is you're not going to be able to be swapping out magazines, and these are actually pretty expensive and hard to find. They're not super hard to modify from AR-15 magazines, but yeah, they really didn't build other magazines other than thermolds, which are just absolute garbage. So you're pretty limited there for magazine options. Price on the AR-180, it's going to get a 3, and that's because these aren't particularly expensive for pre-brand rifles at this point, particularly when it comes to the Sterling made ones, which are going to command a price of around $1,800 to maybe $2,500. Again, the more desirable Costa Mesa or Howa rifles are going to command a little bit more on that $2,500 side, and maybe a little bit higher than that. A lot of the price, though, is going to come from if you ever break anything on this, you're going to be paying whatever somebody is asking for replacement parts, or you're going to be asking somebody to basically make a part out of bar stock for you. So that's going to get fairly expensive. And when it comes to shooting characteristics, I'm going to give this a 3, and it's actually not a bad shooter overall. The trigger is surprisingly good on this. It's got a nice, almost like a single stage pull, which is a little bit on the heavy side, but the reset on it's actually really nice and clunky, which I prefer. The recoil impulse is maybe a little bit brisk, a little bit not really snappy, but it definitely, you can tell that bolt carrier is moving pretty quickly, but it's surprisingly easy to keep on target. So it's not a bad shooter at all. As far as suppressor usage goes, I'm never going to put a can on this thing because I would be worried about it beating itself to death. So that's pretty much an LOL on that one. So I was going to get a 3 in terms of reliability, and that's because I do have a couple of issues every once in a while with it, and that's mainly going to be magazine related, so it's not going to pick up a round off the top of the magazine or something like that, or I just need to give it a little bit of a tap on the charging handle to chamber. And that's not necessarily the rifle's fault. That falls more on the conversion of the magazine, since I mostly use converted magazines with this rifle. But I still have issues every once in a while with it, so I'm going to drop it down to a 3. So the final category is going to be weight, and it's going to come in with a 4, and that's because it weighs 6.7 pounds, so it's going to be surprisingly light for what you think it might be. And when you add it all up, that gives us a score of 24 for the AR-180, which puts it pretty solidly in C tier. So some of the low points for it are going to be the aftermarket availability for it, the durability of the rifle, as well as the modularity. So a lot of things are more modern concepts, so not too surprising for an old rifle. But the accuracy is actually one place where I was surprisingly happy with it, as well as the weight. And finally, for the totally unbiased cool category, I would actually put this up in A tier. So it's something that I find particularly cool about this is kind of the history of the different influences that this rifle has had, whether it's the Brits with the L85 being basically just a bullpupped AR-180, or the SCAR, the HK416, all of them have lines which can be drawn back to the AR-180, which is where I think it really takes off, even though it's a complete commercial failure as a rifle. As far as pop culture appearances go, the only thing I can really think of is Black Ops 6. So this is actually in Black Ops 6 as one of the rifles that you can use, which I was really excited to see because you really don't see these in movies or video games just because, again, they were a commercial flop, so there's not as many out there as you might think. But I want to thank you guys for coming along today and taking a look at the first retro rifle in the series that we can compare to some of the more modern rifles, which a lot of them are going to end up being relatives of this guy, either in the gas system or the bolt carrier group. So kind of a cool thing there. But thank you. Please like, share, subscribe, or whatever it is that helps these things get off the ground. And come back for the next one. Hopefully I'll have it here in a couple of weeks.